Welcome to Northwest Bible Church. Glad you joined us today for our special message on Father's Day for 2022. This morning we want to encourage those of us who are dads and our grandfathers with a vote in favor of that role, fatherhood. And my goal today is to affirm men who step into that role. You know, there's something about Mother's Day that is always affirming. No one ever talks down or criticizes the role of mother. But it seems that when Father's Day comes around, many preachers save their hottest exhortation for those who are dads. I'm not going to do that today. I came across a piece a while ago, and I may have quoted this before, but it seems rather appropriate. It's called Why Fathers Hide Their Feelings. The man who wrote it is D.L. Stewart. He calls himself a husband of one wife, father of 4 children, a dog, and an overactive sump pump. Interesting. I don't know the man. He is an author and syndicated columnist who lives in Ohio. But boy, I sure understand where he's coming from. I quote, "My speech had finished and the audience was generous with its applause. And in the car on the way home, my 14-year-old son turned to me and said, 'I really admire you, Dad. To get up there and give a speech like that, you always know what to say to people. You always seem to know what you're doing.'" Stewart said, "I smiled when he said that, and I may have even blushed modestly, but at that moment, I really didn't know what to say. After a while, I thanked him and reassured him that someday he would be comfortable speaking in front of an audience. But what I really wanted to say to my son that day was that his father was not all that he appeared to be, and that being a man is frequently a facade." It's different for fathers than for mothers, writes Stewart. Motherhood is honest, close to the surface. Mothers don't have to hide what they feel. They don't have to pretend. When there are sounds downstairs in the middle of the night, a mother is allowed to pull the covers over her head and hope that they'll just go away. Fathers, on the other hand, are supposed to put on their slippers and robe and march boldly downstairs, even if he's pretty sure the Manson family is down there waiting for him. When the road signs are confusing and the scenery starts to look unfamiliar, it's perfectly okay for a mother to pull over to the side of the road and ask for directions from the first person who comes along. But a father, he is supposed to know exactly where he's going, even if he has to drive 200 miles out of the way to prove it. When the electricity goes out, no one questions the mother who lights a few candles and waits for the repairman. But everyone wonders about a father who doesn't pick up a screwdriver and head for the basement, even though he doesn't know a fuse box from a sump pump. Mothers can admit to the real estate agent that she doesn't know a thing about fixed rate interest or balloon payments or second mortgages. Fathers are supposed to nod their head and pretend that it all makes perfect sense to them. Mothers can bang a jar of peanut butter on the counter or on the floor until the lid is loose enough to open. Fathers are supposed to twist off the lid with his bare hands without getting red in the face. Mothers who lose their jobs, that's unfortunate. Fathers who lose their jobs are failures. When a mother gets hurt, she may want to swear, but she is allowed to cry. When a father gets hurt, he may want to cry, but he's only allowed to swear. I should have told my son that the only reason his father, like lots of fathers, doesn't admit his weakness is because he's afraid that someone will not think he is a real man. More important, what I should have said to my 14-year-old in the car that night is that someday he will be a father. He will feel fear and self-doubt and pain. And it's all right. But my father never told me, and I haven't yet told him. So dads, it's all right. I've come across several jars that whatever's in there, I can't seem to open. And the older I get and the more my arthritic hands get weaker, the fewer and fewer jars I seem to be able to open. I used to be able to lift the hood on my car and know what to do. Now I just lift the lid and stare and say things like, wow, that's interesting. Hats off to all the men who have endured childbirth without anesthesia, who have stayed awake through numerous piano recitals, who have to place the keys in the hands of a child to a brand new car to that child who just got their first license, and then run upstairs and plunge to your knees hoping that they will somehow find their way back home. That's what it means to be a dad. And this is Dad's Day. It's not a day to put men down. There's enough of that going on in our culture right now. This is a day to say, if you have your father with you on earth, this is the day to say thank you, Dad. And if you don't have him, to look up and say to your Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for a man who was not perfect, but he did invest some things in my life, and I am better for it. There's a proverb that I would like you to turn to that troubles me. It's found in the 30th chapter of that journal of wisdom. We'll spend most of our time today in the Proverbs, but where I'd like to start is the 11th verse of Proverbs chapter 30, and I turn there with a sigh. Because I want to serve something special to the dads today, I must admit that we're living in a generation that doesn't want to serve you anything besides criticism and blame. You're the reason for their hang-ups. What you lacked is the reason that they struggle so much in their young adult life. And so we come to the proverb with a sigh. There are those. And you'll notice that the next 4 verses all begin the same way. If you carry a King James or a New King James, you'll notice that these 4 verses start with there is a generation. It's an interesting Hebrew figure of speech. There's a circle. There's a group. There's a class of people. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. Those who are pure in their own eyes and yet are not cleansed from their filth. Those whose eyes are ever so haughty, whose glances are so disdainful, those whose teeth are swords. Proverbs is beautiful Hebrew poetry. But the writer of the proverb is saying there are those whose teeth cut, whose words slice. They vomit out of their mouths all kinds of bitterness and resentment. They curse. They hate their fathers. They despise their mothers. There's a generation like that, he says. And it's the one that you and I are currently living in. We have taken our direction as a culture from professionals who have told us and encouraged us to blame our parents for whatever might be our problem, and to tell them that. I wonder where the folks are that take time to say to mom and dad, thank you. With all their failures, with all their faults, with all their warts that we certainly know about, simply to say thank you for teaching me. And I'm certain that you can name a couple things. I've got a list of things that I certainly could name. And my parents were far from perfect. But there's no way, with all I learned and experienced with the man that I called father, there's no way I could ever bring myself to cursing him. The hang-ups I have in life are my problem. And I must face them. And I must deal with them. And I solve absolutely nothing by repeating what the professionals would suggest, that Ken Myers was my problem. He's the cause. I have to face the fact that there is in my past failures and disappointments. And of course, I had disagreements and arguments with him, but those were very few in number in comparison to the many good and wonderful benefits I had, and I enjoyed being my father's oldest son. You wouldn't have the pastor you have if it weren't for the parents that I had. You benefit from the legacy of Ken and Doris Myers. And so, dads, maybe today will be a way of reminding you of the value that you are. How you nurtured children, how you've modeled a life before teenagers that watch you, often with a little skeptical snarl. The example of change for adult children who can remember back when you weren't what you should have been, but you change and you obey God, and you're still in process the way He desires you to be. The Greek philosopher Socrates lived 70 years on this earth. He wrote and spoke many wise things, but nothing wiser than this statement. Quote, "Could I climb the highest place in Athens, I would lift my voice and proclaim, fellow citizens, why do you turn and scrape every stone to gather wealth and take so little care of your children, to whom one day you must relinquish it all?" We talk about making a living. It's absolutely important. But making a life is more important. Getting a good salary is perhaps very important to you. Making a reasonable living is a right we claim to have. But your children will never remember what you made. They will never forget what you are. In the 20 years that I lived under my father's roof, I do not have even the slightest idea what he made. But I'll never forget what he modeled. No less than 26 times in the Proverbs, fathers are mentioned, and never once negatively. It's always positive. Isn't that interesting? And most of the Proverbs were written by whom? Solomon. And you know his dad, right? Here's Solomon, fathered by King David, through a woman that he really had no right to claim as his wife. But God somehow righted the wrongs and put Solomon on his feet and gave David's son gifts of wisdom like no one had before or since. Over in Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 6, there's a magnificent statement we need to take a look at. You know, sometimes we race past verses, other times we stop and ponder. This is one to ponder. I'd like to hover over this, especially over the word glory. Proverbs 17:6, children's children are the crown of an old man. And I can tell you that's true. I have been blessed with 10 beautiful grandchildren, all of them 5 and younger. They are the joy of my life. And the glory of children is their father. What an honorable term. It's as though Solomon is etching in stone a word that's not applied ever in the scriptures to mothers, only to fathers. There is in this scene in chapter 17 the thumbprint. There is the character glory. There is the permanent mark, the gentleman we leave on our young, that their mothers never do. I cannot explain why, but there is something about the glory that passes from father to child that isn't matched between mother and child. Mothers are the nurturers, and they're amazing at it, and we love them for it. But how valuable is the bonding in the young years between a father and a child? How important his flexibility in their growing years as they make mistakes and learn how to simply do life, and how necessary is the credibility and the integrity in the later years. So that throughout their time in our homes, children learn that is the glory of my life. He is the one who taught me, modeled for me, lived with me through, and they could name a number of things. They don't expect you to be perfect. They couldn't live with you if you were, because they're imperfect. Now, maybe some who hear my voice are battered and bruised. And that's where you find yourself today, and much of that dysfunction is from your father. But I challenge you to locate some of the fine points that you are grateful for and focus on them. That's what Solomon does. There's not a word about a weak father, not a word about a father that lacked discipline when dealing with more than one of his sons. Not a word about a father who indulged an oldest son. Not a word about a father who did nothing when a son committed rape. And if we just read the story of David, how negligent he was with his own children. But when Solomon, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writes the Proverbs, he exalts the place of father. And you look in vain today and to find any place in our media where a father is not mocked. He's the fool of the commercials. He is the nutcase in the cartoons. He is the prejudiced wimp in the sitcom. He is not the leader. He is not the respected glory of the family. And unfortunately, far too many are being conformed to the image of our culture rather than transformed by God's truth. I'd like to spend our time together and highlight 2 areas why I vote in favor of fatherhood. The first one is the role the father fills, and the second one is the relationships a father cultivates. First, the role that a father fills. And I can think of 3 areas, areas that I would like to highlight, again, from unique proverbs that are found within that journal. The first role is that of provider. Proverbs 19:14, houses and riches are an inheritance from fathers. It's the symbol of provision. When you think back, chances are good that you had a place to live and food to eat out of the cold and out of the rain because your father went to work. The money you needed to survive was probably provided by your father. Now, I'm not saying mothers don't work, they do. But the primary responsibility of being a provider is the father's. Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. You'd think it would say to his children. And he does, but it goes even further than that. A good man thinks beyond just the immediate generation. He thinks about his grandchildren and even his great-grandchildren. That's on a father's mind when he's providing. Today is a good day to stop and express our gratitude for our fathers and grandfathers who were exemplary models of hard work. The fathers who traveled thousands of miles to keep food on the table, made hundreds of decisions so that the family had what the family needed. You know, when you put a face to these kind of situations, and a man has to deal with his ability to provide being threatened by job loss or changes in the working world, I find most men don't make decisions on what's best for their career or best for them or their business. They make decisions based on what's best for the family. Fathers stand firm for their family, and they take time to communicate the value of the family. And to my last day, I'll be grateful for the model of my dad's work ethic. He was a worker, and he modeled that for my brothers and I. But not just a provider, he was also a maintainer. That's the second role I'd like to highlight. Proverbs 22:28. Do not move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. Now we understand the historical context here, the significance. The background, of course, is the Hebrew people. But I'd like to see the practical side of this, the firm boundaries that are set by our fathers. You probably had a father that set certain boundaries in your home. If not, I'm sorry for you. The father is usually the one who establishes where the family will stand on certain issues. I remember my dad making it very clear that church attendance was not optional. We went whether we felt like it or not, and there was a certain standard of dress for members of his family. It didn't matter what anyone else did because he had the standard. He set the standard. He established the boundaries of behavior, of morality, and of integrity. That didn't rest on the shoulders of my mom. That rested with my father. That was his assignment. Now, to be honest, do I think he was too rigid at times? Yeah, of course. But he provided incredible security for my brothers and I, knowing that our dad was the boundary maintainer, and you didn't violate the boundary. I think sometimes kids would rather go in the wrong direction than no direction. And we see that's true in our fatherless culture. One author very insightfully writes these words: we live in an era where our children and we have been victimized by one disappointment after another. Our heroes seem to be in short supply. Many of those who we once looked at have turned out to be failing idols. Greedy, corrupt, far less admirable than we'd imagined. There are scandals in politics, embezzlement in charities, strikes by doctors and firemen. cheating at West Point, games fixed by pro athletes, adultery in churches. Who can you trust nowadays? Cynicism prevails, creating a vacuum of disbelief in anything worthwhile, including religious faith. Don't think that our children and grandchildren can't read the tea leaves, man. They understand what's going on in our world, and they're being impacted by it. I mean, they're old enough to understand what's happening. You can't, and you probably shouldn't hide it from them. But are there not still more heroes to be trusted and believed in, rather than the few who fail? Sure, all heroes fail at one time or another. I understand that. But what doesn't make the headlines is the consistency of the man who day in, day out battles for his family. Our children need to learn the value of having heroes, people that they should admire. But they also need to learn that no one walks on water. All of them can, and in some ways do fail, but there is no hero a child needs more than their dad. Trust me, they want sometimes in their life, a man that they can lean on, that's able to say, I'm here for you, whatever the struggle. Their memories will look back and will be grateful for the model that we are. And the sooner that we're willing to admit that we're not perfect, that we fail, and admit when we're wrong, man, they will love us more and they will admire us even more. We just have to say those hard words. I was wrong. I failed. Please forgive me. You know, and I don't know anyone more forgiving than children. And they're pretty good forgetters as well. Third role is the role of instructor. After provider, maintainer, there's this role of instructor. And while I'm casting a vote in favor of fatherhood and in the roles that we fill, I'd like us to look at some of the instruction that Solomon pens in the Proverbs. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 1, we see he's busy instructing his son. Proverbs 1 verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. There will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. Chapter 4, verse 1. Listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I will give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. When I was a boy in my father's house, still tender and the only child of my mother, he taught me and said, lay hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands and you will live. Get wisdom. Get understanding. It's interesting when Jesus tells the story we know as the prodigal son, who decided to leave his father and ended up in a pig pen. When he came to his senses, he remembered his father. It's interesting, there isn't a single word in the story about his mother. As valuable as she was, as irreplaceable as she was, it was the father's instruction, the father's model that drew the boy back home. Here is a wayward lad and a waiting dad. The father is looking for him on the horizon, and when he sees that familiar silhouette, he runs to greet his boy. They embrace in affection. The very things the boy was looking for could only be found at home. Proverbs chapter 6, my son, obey your father's commands. And don't neglect your mother's teaching. Keep their words always in your heart. Tie them around your neck. Wherever you walk, their counsel will lead you. Where you sleep, they will protect you. When you wake up in the morning, they will advise you. Remember the first time you lived on your own? What was it that you relied on when you woke up in the morning? Without exception, it was probably something that you learned at home. When kids go off to college, the reason they get homesick is they miss the affirmation and encouragement, the familiar surroundings, the hugs of acceptance. We may hate some of the technologies of our world, especially cell phones that seem people's faces are just glued to them sometimes. But you know what? I think the cell phone is one of the most needed accessories at college. They need that contact. Do you remember your father's instruction about the choice of friends? How running with the wrong people will cause you pain? I learned that from my father. How about the importance of integrity? How about doing well in school? Usually you knew he was pushing too hard. Mine pushed too hard when it comes to my schooling. But you knew he was right. There was something about a dad that sees through the fog of excuses. You were blessed to have a father that told you about life, how to relate to the opposite sex, how to keep yourself pure when you're alone, how to keep from reading materials that'll make your mind a sewer, how to go to the right films, how to stay out of the backseat of a car. Was he the one who talked to you about maintaining your virginity? That's what this passage is about right here. The chapter goes on, verse 23, "For these commands and this teaching are a lamp to light the way ahead of you. The correction of discipline is the way of life. These commands and these teachings will keep you from the immoral woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulterous woman." Did your dad ever talk to you about watching out for the immoral woman? Don't lust for her beauty. Don't let her coyness seduce you. Why? Because it's all superficial. There's loss of integrity. There's loss of self-respect. For a prostitute will bring you to poverty, and sleeping with another man's wife may cost you your very life. When you give in to the temptation of the moment, you lose. And you lose in more ways than I have time to describe. We have an amazing opportunity as dads to be ministers of grace when our children fail. Not to relieve them of the consequences of their mistakes, but to be the healer of their broken hearts. When they failed, they don't need to be reminded that they failed. They know that. But you can remind them of your love and forgiveness and the grace that rebuilds. And by the way, grace also keeps a confidence. Don't make your kids' failures the topic of conversation with other parents. It's how you exasperate your children. Talking about exasperation, over in Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul has a wonderful single verse that it kind of stays between dads and sons and daughters. It's not for moms or even grandparents. It's just for dads. "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord." William Hendrickson does a marvelous job with this single verse as he describes 6 different ways that we can exasperate our children. And the term to exasperate or to provoke is a vivid term. It describes the boiling emotion of anger. We can cause our children to sin by our provoking them, and we don't solve anything. In fact, we create a distance between us, and I'll tell you, it happens most with our adult children when we don't step back and take our hands off. Hendrickson says, we exasperate our children first by overprotection, second by favoritism, third by discouragement, fourth by failing to allow our children to grow up and have their own ideas, especially when we belittle their ideas, fifth by neglect, and sixth by cruel words or physical abuse. There are many people today that you rub shoulders with that are trying to crawl out of the horrible hole that their father dug, who exasperated them. But that's the negative. Look at the positive. Fathers, don't provoke your children into anger, but bring them up in the discipline. That's our goal, to bring them up. And the word discipline is strict discipline. Not unfair, not unjust, not inflexible, but strict. Are your children or grandchildren learning to respect authority? The teachers, the policemen, they need to know that they need to respect that position for their own good. And they learn that at home first. When a father or mother says it's to be respected. When you demand as a father that the children respect their mom. And a mom demands that the children respect their dad. Sometimes with young kids, because I said so is enough. Now, when they get a little older and they can reason, I would suggest 8, 9, 10 years old, then you need to start giving reasons why. But not when they're 3 and 4 and 5. I said so, that's enough. Do them a favor. Discipline them fairly and consistently. And do your society a favor. Graduate from your home young adults who are self-disciplined. That's the goal of discipline, that they would become self-disciplined. But not just discipline, also the instruction of the Lord. This word means training by word of encouragement. And when that's is not sufficient, reproof is required. Nourish them to maturity with words. Conversation, talk. Do you still talk? Eyeball to eyeball? With your children, your grandchildren, without the TV on? It's never too late to start doing what is right. Start today. I promise you that they'll understand when you begin. You know, son, daughter, grandson, it's been a number of months that I've really needed to have a conversation with you because, to be honest with you, I've blown it. I've really dropped the ball, and I want to tell you with all my heart, and you tell them what you need to say. They may not listen right away. But the more you keep at it, the more consistent you are, the quicker that they will hear the words. And not just the words, but the conviction behind the words. Dads, there's an instruction that is deeper than religious instruction. Notice that Paul says it's of the Lord. Some of your best instruction will be casual. It'll be just your example, your model. Maybe just spending time. Raymond Edmond, the legendary president of Wheaton College, wrote, "Looking back on the way I brought up my children, if I had to do it over, I would spend more time with them in simple, non-religious activities. Fishing, at a baseball game, learning a skill, working on the car, weeding the garden together, and you talk. Secondly, I cast my vote in favor of relationships that you cultivate. Tucked back in Proverbs chapter 5 is a picture of fun and happiness. First, your responsibility is to cultivate a relationship with your children's mother. I know that's a different way of saying it. The relationship you sustain with your wife, their mother. One of the greatest gifts you can give your children is the gift of affection for their mother. Proverbs 5:15. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. These are figures of speech. This is poetry, okay? He's not talking about wells and water and buckets and drawing water out of a well. He's talking about relationships. He's talking specifically about a relationship with your spouse, your wife. Verse 16. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? It's rhetorical, of course not. Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. Look at that. That's the picture of affection and romance between mom and dad, between your children's father and their mother. Verse 20, why be captivated, my son, by an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife? It is okay for your kids to see affection between you and your wife. And I'll be honest with you, there were times when I thought my mom and dad ought to head to the bedroom, for crying out loud. I mean, he'd come in late from work and just for dinner, and he'd come in and, well, you know. Remember the story of a pastor who decided that he wanted, with his family, to read through the Bible in a year. They arrived at the Song of Solomon. They're reading the song, and their 11-year-old son said, Dad, should I really be listening to this? Yes, is the answer. Affection for your wife. Don't be afraid to show it. Don't be afraid to say it. Don't be afraid to demonstrate it in front of your children. Your children will love you and her all the more for it. Where are they supposed to learn that if they don't learn it from you? And secondly, of course, is your relationship with your children themselves. Proverbs 15:20, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother. Proverbs 23, verse 24, the father of a righteous man has great joy. He who has a wise son delights in him. May your father and mother be glad. May she who gave you birth rejoice. It's a challenge for some folks whose parents are still living, but especially to the young who still live at home. This is a picture of the happy family. In fact, I think I went past another Proverbs 20, verse 7, the righteous man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. Gentlemen, I don't know what your world is like, and I'm sure it doesn't look anything like mine. I'm sure your work world and your family life has its challenges. So does mine. And I'm sure I would never be able to measure up if I had to walk in your shoes. But you know what? Neither can your child. Think for a second about how you are viewed by your child. Think of how overwhelming you could appear in the eyes of your children or grandchildren. You may be very capable in your field, a professional, highly degreed. Your success could be the downfall of your relationships unless, when you're at home, you take off that hat. When you walk through the door at home, you leave work outside. On the Edge of the Spotlight is a book that was written by Kathy Cronkite, the daughter of Walter Cronkite, the infamous news anchor back in the 60s and 70s. In her book, she writes about life for herself and 26 other children of celebrity fathers. It was written back in 1981. In the book, she comments, "I can remember once having an intimate conversation with my father, and a man came up to us and pushed me aside and asked my dad what he thought about the Middle East. I was actually pushed aside and shoved out of the way by that man." When you're 30, you can deal with that. But when you're 6 or 16, it's hard to take. Dads, we need to treasure the oneness we have with our children. And don't let anyone ever come between you and your child. Kathy Cronkite dedicates her book to Scott, the son of Paul Newman, who took his own life in an overdose back in the late 70s. In her opinion, and in the opinion of the Newman family, it was probably because Scott couldn't cope with his celebrity father. Now, it wasn't his father's fault, of course. It was the boy's decision, but she describes the scene of one of Scott's sisters who commented, "All our life, I am sure this was true for Scott too, we felt that we had to be famous and successful. It's only recently I figured out, hey, you really don't have to be famous if you don't want to. Figuring that out has relaxed me and made me feel happier. Maybe Scott never figured that out. He died trying to be just like Dad." I think we need to help our kids who struggle trying to be like us. Help them know they are valuable just like they are. Convince them of it. Take the time. There's an old saying that goes like this: when God realized he couldn't be everywhere, he decided to make fathers. There's only one problem with that statement. It's heretical. God is everywhere. And no dad can ever take the place of God the Father. I shudder at the thought of having to be compared to him. And my kids have never required of me that. Thank goodness. Probably the reason I think that my kids have been so forgiving is because they never felt like they had to measure up to some hotshot dad whose expectations were impossible. You know, someday I'll be gone. Someday you'll be gone. And our children will hold us only in their memory. And that's all they'll be able to claim. And they'll remember that we were a certain kind of father. They probably won't remember the public part of our lives, but they will remember the private part. What will they remember? Brian Lockerbie Bruce Lockerbie, in his excellent book, Father Love, concludes with these words, and I conclude with these today. Quote, "When I was just 11 years old, our family drove from Toronto to Eastern Ontario to the region north of the St. Lawrence River where my father had been born. We reached the little village of Ventnor in Spencerville just before midnight. The residents had long since gone to bed. But Dad needed directions to find the old homestead where we would spend the night. Reluctantly, he stopped at a darkened house and knocked on the door. After several minutes of waiting, the yard light came on and an older man opened the door. I could hear my father apologizing for the inconvenience. And then he identified himself as the son of Person Lockerbie, my grandfather, who had been dead for more than 20 years. The man in the doorway said, "Oh, come in, come in. No trouble at all. We knew your father." Lockerbie concludes his book, "That is the greatest legacy a man can leave his son." Relationships with your wife, with your children. It's the legacy you leave. Yes, we're providers. Yes, we're maintainers of the boundaries. Yes, we are to be instructors. Those are the roles we fill. But the most important part are the relationships that we build within that building we call home. May you realize the value that you are to that home. May you invest your life, your time, your energies in those relationships. And may your children enjoy the memories of a life well lived when the Lord Jesus has taken you home. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for my memories. Thank you for the memories of not great men, but good men. Men worth the title of hero. There are so many of them, Lord, I would miss some if I started to name them in my life. Thank you for each of them. Thank you for their long obedience in the same direction. For Jesus' sake, amen.